They were sent to die, but came back as legends. The morning fog hung thick over the Belgian Ardennes on December 18, 1944, 3 days after the German offensive that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge had shattered the quiet winter landscape. In a bombed-out farmhouse 6 miles behind what used to be the American lines, First Lieutenant Marcus Webb crouched over a map that was already outdated by 72 hours. The red pencil marks showing friendly positions meant nothing now. The Germans had punched through like a sledgehammer through ice. And somewhere in that chaos of retreating units and advancing panzers, Webb's 12-man reconnaissance patrol had become completely and utterly lost. Webb was 24 years old, a former architecture student from Philadelphia who never imagined he'd be responsible for keeping men alive in a frozen hell where the front lines moved faster than the maps could track them. He ran his fingers through his dark hair, matted with 3 days of sweat and dirt despite the bone-chilling cold, and looked at the faces of the men gathered around him in the cellar of the farmhouse. They were watching him with eyes that had seen too much in too little time, waiting for him to say something that would make sense of their situation. Staff Sergeant Roy Kowalski sat on an overturned crate, methodically cleaning his rifle for the 3rd time that morning. Kowalski was 31, ancient by infantry standards, a coal miner from Pennsylvania who'd survived North Africa and Sicily before volunteering for reconnaissance duty because, as he'd said with typical gallows humor, he was tired of being shot at by people he could see. Next to him, Private First Class James Chin checked and rechecked the radio that had given them nothing but static for the past 18 hours. Chin was an Issei soldier from California whose family was still in an internment camp while he fought for the country that had imprisoned them. He worked the dials with steady, patient hands, refusing to give up on the machine that represented their only link to friendly forces. Corporal William, Doc, Morrison, their medic, sat against the cold stone wall inventorying their medical supplies for what must have been the 10th time. Morrison had been a veterinarian in civilian life, studying to be a surgeon when the war interrupted his plans. Now he applied his knowledge of anatomy to keeping soldiers alive in conditions that would have horrified his professors. His supplies were running dangerously low. 3 morphine syrettes remaining, bandages that had been reused until they were more blood than cloth, sulfa powder down to the last few packets. Private Tommy Breslin, the youngest of them at 19, tried to keep warm in the corner, his thin frame shaking despite the 2 extra jackets he'd scavenged from the dead. Breslin was a farm boy from Iowa who'd lied about his age to enlist, desperate to escape the suffocating predictability of life on the family homestead. He'd found adventure, all right, though not the kind they showed in the recruitment posters. Next to him, Corporal Eddie Martinez cleaned his Thompson submachine gun, his movements economical and practiced. Martinez had grown up in the Los Angeles barrio, where he'd learned early that survival meant staying alert and trusting your instincts. Those instincts had kept him alive through 2 years of combat. Private First Class Joseph Kowalski, Roy's younger brother, stood watch at the cellar entrance, his eyes scanning the fog-shrouded landscape through a crack in the boards they'd nailed over the window. Joe was 26, quieter than his older brother, haunted by something he'd seen during the initial German breakthrough that he hadn't talked about yet. The brothers had enlisted together, fought together, and had an unspoken pact to make sure they both went home together. Private Sam Washington, a former railway porter from Chicago, checked their ammunition supply, counting and recounting the dwindling bullets and grenades. Washington had joined up to prove something to a country that still made him sit at the back of the bus, and he'd proven it over and over in the blood and mud of France and Belgium. Technician 5th grade Harold Leibovitz worked beside Chin on the radio, his technical expertise their last hope for re-establishing contact. Leibovitz had been an electrical engineer in New York, brilliant enough to have gotten an officer's commission if he'd wanted it, but he'd stayed enlisted because, as he put it, officers had to make decisions that got people killed, and he preferred to just fix things. Private Raymond Boucher, a Cajun from Louisiana who spoke French better than English, studied the map with Webb, trying to match the terrain they'd crossed with the features marked on paper. Boucher was their translator, invaluable in occupied France but less useful now in Belgium where most civilians had fled or were hiding. Private First Class Vincent Cardone, a tough kid from Boston's North End, sharpened his trench knife against a whetstone with long, deliberate strokes. Cardone had the kind of street-smart toughness that made him invaluable in close combat, and he'd saved more than one man's life with that knife when ammunition ran out or silence was essential. Finally, there was Private Gerald Hoffman, a quiet German-American from Wisconsin who spoke German fluently, and whose grandmother still lived in Bavaria. Hoffman carried the burden of fighting against the land of his ancestors, and he did it with grim determination, knowing that the Germany his grandmother had told him stories about was not the Germany sending panzers through the Ardennes. Webb looked at these 11 men, these ordinary Americans who'd been thrown together by the chaos of war and welded into something stronger through shared hardship, and he knew he had to tell them the truth. They deserved that much. He cleared his throat, and the quiet conversations in the cellar died away. Even the sound of Cardon's knife against the stone stopped. 12 pairs of eyes focused on their young lieutenant, waiting. "We're cut off," Webb said simply. No point in sugarcoating it. These were veterans who'd seen enough combat to recognize the situation they were in. "Best I can figure from the map and what we've observed, the Germans have pushed at least 15 miles past our original positions. We're approximately 8 miles behind enemy lines, and that gap is widening every hour. Radio's dead, which means either our equipment is damaged or the Germans are jamming everything in this sector. Either way, we're on our own." He paused, letting that sink in. Kowalski stopped cleaning his rifle. Chen's hands stilled on the radio dials. Doc Morrison closed his medical kit with a soft click that seemed loud in the sudden silence. Webb continued, keeping his voice steady and matter-of-fact. "We've got 3 options as I see it. 1, we hole up here and wait for our lines to stabilize and push back through. 2, we try to infiltrate west through German positions and link up with whatever's left of our forces. 3, we head north toward Liège, which should still be in Allied hands, assuming the Germans haven't taken it in the last 3 days. Sergeant Kowalski spoke first, his voice gravelly from years of breathing coal dust and cigarette smoke. "Option 1, suicide, Lieutenant. Germans are using every building as a strongpoint. They'll sweep through here eventually, and 12 men with limited ammunition aren't going to hold off a company of panzer grenadiers." He gestured with his rifle toward the boarded-up windows. "This place is a trap, not a fortress." Martinez nodded in agreement. "West is no good either, sir. We'd have to cross 6, maybe 8 miles of German-controlled territory? In winter, with every road crawling with their forces? We wouldn't make it 2 miles before running into a checkpoint or a patrol. And we don't have enough ammunition for sustained firefights." Chen looked up from the radio, his face drawn with exhaustion. "North is our best bet, Lieutenant. It's further, maybe 25 miles to Liège, but the Germans push south and southeast, not north. We'd be moving parallel to their advance rather than directly through it. Better odds." He tapped the silent radio with frustration. "And if I can get this working, which I might be able to do if we can find some replacement tubes, we'd have a better chance of reaching friendly forces once we're closer to Liège." Webb studied the map again, tracing potential routes north with his finger. 25 miles through enemy territory in winter with limited supplies, wounded men to care for, and no idea where German forces might be concentrated. It wasn't a good plan. But it was the only plan that didn't end with all of them dead or captured within 48 hours. He made his decision. "We go north," he said firmly. "Travel at night, hole up during the day. We avoid all contact with enemy forces if possible, conserve ammunition, and move as fast as the terrain allows. We're reconnaissance, which means our job is to observe and report, not to fight. If we can't report, then our job is to survive until we can." He looked at each man in turn. "I'm not going to lie to you. This is going to be hell. But we've been through hell before and come out the other side. We do it again. We watch each other's backs, we keep moving, and we make it home. Questions?" Private Breslin raised his hand tentatively, like he was still in school back in Iowa. "Lieutenant, what about civilians? If we run into any Belgians, do we try to get information from them, or do we avoid them too?" It was a good question, and it showed the kid was thinking, which was more than some veterans did after they'd been in combat long enough. Webb considered it carefully before answering. "We approach with extreme caution. Remember, the Germans are sending infiltrators through the lines in American uniforms, speaking English, creating confusion and spreading panic. That means the locals won't know who to trust either. If we encounter civilians who can help us, we accept help. But we don't put them at risk, and we don't linger. The Germans are executing anyone they catch helping Allied soldiers." Doc Morrison spoke up, his voice quiet but steady. "Lieutenant, I need to address the medical situation. Private Kowalski has a shrapnel wound in his leg that's not healing properly. It's not infected yet, but it will be if we're marching through snow and sleeping in frozen barns. I've got maybe 3 days of supplies left if nobody gets hit. If we run into combat, I can do basic first aid and that's about it. Joe Kowalski, leaning against the wall by the cellar entrance, shook his head stubbornly. I can walk, document. I'll keep up. Don't worry about me. But his face was pale, and Webb could see the pain in his eyes. The younger Kowalski brother was tough, but toughness only went so far when you had metal fragments in your leg and the cold was seeping into your bones. We'll take it slow, Webb assured him. Nobody gets left behind. That's a promise. We've lost enough men in the last 3 days. I'm not losing any more. He folded the map and tucked it into his jacket. We move out at dusk. That gives us about 4 hours to rest, eat what rations we have left, and prepare. Chen, Leibovitz, I want you to strip down that radio and figure out exactly what's wrong with it. If there's any chance of getting it working, I want to know. Washington, inventory our ammunition one more time and distribute it evenly. I want every man carrying the same basic load so if someone goes down, we can redistribute quickly. Boucher, you're on point. Your eyes are the best we've got. Martinez, you take rear guard. Kowalski, your second position, right behind Boucher. The men moved to follow their orders, and Webb felt a small measure of relief. They were scared, cold, running low on everything that mattered in combat, and cut off behind enemy lines, but they were still functioning as a unit. That was something. That was everything, really. The German offensive had scattered entire divisions, turned regiments into panicked mobs fleeing west, but here in this frozen cellar, 12 men were still soldiers. Still a team. Still fighting. As the afternoon wore on, Webb made his rounds, checking on each man individually. It was something his company commander had taught him back in England during training. Know your men, the captain had said. Not just their names and where they're from, but who they are, what they fear, what they hope for. It had seemed like sentimental nonsense at the time, when war was still theoretical and death was something that happened to other people. Now Webb understood. These men weren't just soldiers under his command. They were brothers, fathers, sons, husbands. Each one carried a whole world inside him. People back home who were counting on him to come back alive. He found Boucher studying the map, his finger tracing a route north along small roads and farm tracks. The Cajun looked up as Webb approached. What do you think? Webb asked, pointing at the route Boucher had marked. I think we stay off the main roads entirely, Lieutenant, Boucher said in his thick accent. The Germans, they're using the highways to move their tanks and supplies. But these little farm roads, these paths between villages, they might not have the forces to patrol everyone. We move through the forest where we can, use the tree cover. It'll be slower, but safer. He tapped a spot on the map about halfway to Liège. This is the town of Malmedy. We need to stay well clear of it. Germans definitely control it now, and they'll have established checkpoints on every approach. Webb nodded. Boucher was right. Slow and safe was better than fast and dead. He moved on to where the Kowalski brothers sat together, Roy finishing his rifle maintenance while Joe kept watch. The family resemblance was strong. Both had the same square jaw, the same blue eyes that seemed too gentle for men who'd seen as much combat as they had. How's the leg? Webb asked Joe quietly. Been worse. Joe lied. They both knew he was lying. Roy looked at his younger brother with an expression that was half exasperation, half fierce protectiveness. He needs antibiotics, Lieutenant. Sulfa powder isn't cutting it. But he's too stubborn to admit it. We get to Liège, first thing we do is get you to a proper aid station, Webb promised. Until then, Doc will keep you going. Won't you, Doc? Morrison, who'd been listening from a few feet away, came over and knelt beside Joe. Let me change that dressing, he said, already opening his medical kit. As he worked, Joe gritted his teeth but didn't make a sound. Webb watched Morrison's efficient movements, the gentle way he handled the inflamed wound, and felt grateful once again that they had a medic who knew his business. Chern and Leibovitz had the radio spread across a wooden crate, its components laid out like the organs of a dissected animal. Leibovitz held a vacuum tube up to what little light filtered through the boards over the windows, examining it carefully. This one's blown, he announced, and I think the transformer might be damaged too. Without replacement parts, I can't fix it, Lieutenant. I'm sorry. Webb squeezed his shoulder. You tried. That's all anyone can ask. He raised his voice so everyone could hear. Radio's dead. Which means when we reach friendly lines, we're going to have to identify ourselves very carefully. The whole army is on edge right now, looking for German infiltrators. We approach any American position slowly, hands visible, and we follow whatever challenge procedure they give us. The last thing we need is to survive German territory only to get shot by our own people. As dusk approached, the men prepared to move out. They gathered their gear, checked their weapons one final time, and stood in a rough circle in the cellar. Without anyone suggesting it, they bowed their heads. Doc Morrison, as the closest thing they had to a spiritual advisor, spoke quietly. Lord, we've asked you for a lot these past few years. We've asked you to keep us safe, to watch over the folks back home, to give us the strength to do what needs doing. Today we're asking for guidance. Help us find our way home. Help us watch out for each other. And if it's not too much to ask, help us all make it through this alive. Amen. A chorus of amens echoed in the cellar. Then, without further ceremony, they filed up the narrow stairs and out into the gathering darkness. The temperature had dropped as the sun set, and their breath came out in white clouds. Boucher took point as ordered, his rifle at the ready, his eyes scanning the landscape. Behind him came Kowalski, then Webb, then the rest of the patrol in a staggered column with Martinez bringing up the rear. They moved quietly, professionally, ghosts in the twilight. The first night of their journey was a masterclass in nerve-wracking tension. Every shadow could hide German soldiers. Every sound, every snapping branch or distant engine, sent adrenaline surging through their systems. They moved cross-country through frozen fields and silent forests, avoiding roads and villages. The snow had stopped falling, but what was already on the ground crunched under their boots no matter how carefully they stepped. Joe Kowalski limped along grimly, refusing to slow the pace despite the obvious pain. His brother stayed close, ready to catch him if he stumbled. Around midnight they heard vehicles on a road they were paralleling, maybe half a mile to the west. The patrol froze, dropping to the ground and waiting. Through the trees, they could see headlights, a lot of them, a whole convoy moving south toward the fighting. Webb counted at least 20 trucks, probably carrying infantry to reinforce the breakthrough. The Germans were pouring everything they had into this offensive, trying to reach the Meuse River before the Allies could reorganize their defense. As the convoy passed and the sound of engines faded, Webb gave the signal to move out. They'd lost 20 minutes, but they'd avoided contact. That was a win. They covered maybe 8 miles that first night, a pathetically short distance, but Webb knew they were lucky to have made it that far without running into enemy patrols. As dawn approached, Boucher found them shelter in an abandoned hunting lodge deep in a pine forest. The building was small, just one room with a stone fireplace and wooden bunks along the walls, but it was solid and defensible and, most importantly, isolated. They couldn't risk a fire despite the cold, so they huddled together for warmth, taking turns on watch while the others tried to sleep. Webb took the first watch, positioning himself by a window that gave him a view of the approach to the lodge. As his men slept, or tried to sleep, he thought about the mission that had brought them here. They'd been sent forward 3 days ago to scout German positions, a routine reconnaissance patrol that should have taken them out and back in 24 hours. But the German offensive had exploded across the front before they could report back, and they'd found themselves trapped behind rapidly advancing enemy forces. In the chaos of those first hours, when entire American units were being overrun or surrendering, Webb had made the decision to go to ground and wait for an opportunity to escape. Now, 3 days later, they were finally making their move. He wondered what was happening in the wider battle. How far had the Germans advanced? Had the Allied command managed to stabilize the front? Were American troops counterattacking, or still falling back in disarray? Without the radio, they had no way of knowing. They were operating in a vacuum, making decisions based on incomplete information and educated guesses. It was terrifying, but it was also strangely liberating. All he had to worry about was keeping his men alive and getting them home. Everything else, the grand strategy and the movement of armies, was someone else's problem. Washington relieved him after 2 hours, and Webb tried to sleep, but sleep came hard. His mind wouldn't stop racing, running through scenarios, planning routes, calculating odds. When he finally dozed off, he dreamed of Philadelphia, of walking through the streets near the university, of sitting in architecture studios and discussing the principles of design. It seemed like another lifetime, another world. That Marcus Webb, the student who'd worried about grades and dates and whether he'd get a job after graduation, had died somewhere in the mud of France. The man who'd taken his place was harder, colder, but also more focused. He knew what mattered now. Keeping his men alive mattered. Getting them home mattered. Everything else was just noise. The second night, they made better progress, covering 12 miles through terrain that gradually shifted from dense forest to open farmland. This was more dangerous territory, fewer places to hide, but the lack of cover also meant they could see threats coming from further away. Twice they spotted German positions, hastily dug foxholes and machine gun nests covering crossroads, and both times they were able to detour around them without being detected. Boucher was proving to be an exceptional point man, his instincts for danger keeping them safe. But their luck couldn't hold forever. On the third night, about 18 miles from where they'd started and maybe 7 miles from Liège, they walked into an ambush. It happened fast. One moment they were moving through a small valley between snow-covered hills, and the next moment the night exploded with gunfire. Tracer rounds lit up the darkness, green German tracers arcing toward them from both sides of the valley. Someone screamed. Webb hit the ground hard, his mind processing information at lightning speed. They'd walked into a prepared position. Germans dug in on the high ground with overlapping fields of fire. Classic ambush. Professional. Deadly. Cover! Find cover! He shouted, knowing even as he said it that there wasn't much cover to be found. They were in a kill zone, exactly where the Germans wanted them. His men scattered, some diving behind small rocks, others into shallow depressions in the ground that offered minimal protection. Martinez's Thompson submachine gun chattered as he returned fire, trying to suppress the German positions. Kowalski's rifle cracked methodically. 1 shot, 2 shots, 3 shots. The older sergeant was staying calm, picking his targets. Webb crawled through the snow toward a fallen tree that offered slightly better cover. Beside him, Chin was pulling himself forward using his elbows, his leg dragging behind him. He'd been hit. Webb grabbed the back of Chen's jacket and hauled him the rest of the way to the tree, ignoring the bullets snapping through the air around them. Once they had some protection, he checked Chen's wound. The bullet had gone through his calf, ugly but not immediately life-threatening if they could stop the bleeding. "Doc!" Webb yelled. "Chen's hit." Morrison was already moving, crawling from position to position like a man possessed. He reached them and immediately went to work on Chen's leg, wrapping it tightly with one of his precious remaining bandages. Chin gritted his teeth but didn't cry out. The radio operator knew better than to make noise that would draw fire. The firefight lasted maybe 5 minutes, though it felt like hours. The Germans had expected to wipe out whoever walked into their trap with that first devastating volley, but Webb's men were too experienced to panic. They returned fire effectively, forcing the Germans to keep their heads down, and then, when Webb gave the order, they executed a fighting withdrawal. Martinez and Kowalski provided covering fire while the rest of the patrol pulled back. Then they leapfrogged, Martinez and Kowalski falling back while others covered them. It was textbook infantry tactics, drilled into them through countless training exercises, now executed under fire with lives on the line. They lost Cardone in the withdrawal. The tough kid from Boston took a burst of machine gun fire across his chest and went down hard. Webb saw him fall, saw the blood dark against the snow, and knew there was nothing they could do. Cardone was dead before he hit the ground. But they couldn't stop, couldn't recover his body. If they did, more men would die. So they kept moving, kept firing, kept pulling back until they were out of the kill zone and into the relative safety of a wooded hillside. Webb counted heads as they regrouped, his heart pounding. 11 men. They were down to 11. Cardone was gone. And Chin was wounded, unable to walk without help. Joe Kowalski's face was gray with pain and exhaustion, his leg wound having reopened during the desperate scramble for cover. Doc Morrison's hands were shaking as he tried to treat both men with his rapidly diminishing supplies. "We need to move," Kowalski said, his voice urgent. "They'll be coming after us." That wasn't just a random patrol. That was a prepared position, which means there are more Germans in this area than we thought. Webb nodded. Kowalski was right. But Chin couldn't walk, and Joe Kowalski was barely staying on his feet. "We make a stretcher for Chin," he decided. "Use 2 rifles and jackets. Kowalski and Washington, you carry him. We'll rotate every 15 minutes so nobody gets too tired. Joe, you lean on your brother. We move slow, but we move. 5 miles to Liège. We can make 5 miles. They fashioned the stretcher quickly, Chin protesting weakly that he could walk, but nobody listened to him. Washington and Hoffman took the first shift carrying him, and they started moving again, away from the ambush site, deeper into the hills. Behind them, they could hear German voices shouting commands, organizing a pursuit. But the forest was thick, the night was dark, and Webb's patrol knew how to move quietly. Within an hour, they'd lost their pursuers. But the cost had been high. They'd lost Cardone, a good soldier and a good man. Chin was wounded and couldn't fight. Joe Kowalski was deteriorating rapidly, his leg infection spreading despite Doc Morrison's best efforts. Their ammunition was more than half gone after the firefight, and they were still miles from safety, in territory that was clearly more heavily occupied by German forces than they'd hoped. Webb called a brief halt in a thick grove of pines where they had some concealment. His men collapsed, exhausted, running on adrenaline and sheer willpower. He looked at their faces, saw the fear and the determination mixed together, and knew he had to say something. Had to give them a reason to keep going. "Listen to me," he said, keeping his voice low but firm. "We just survived an ambush that should have killed all of us. We fought our way out, and we're still moving. Cardone is gone, and we'll mourn him when we get home. But right now, we honor him by finishing what we started. We've come too far to quit. Liège is close. Maybe 4 or 5 miles. We rest here for 30 minutes, catch our breath, then we push on. Before dawn, we'll be behind American lines. We'll be safe. We'll have made it. You trust me?" One by one, they nodded. Even Chin, pale and sweating on his makeshift stretcher, managed a weak nod. They trusted him. God help him, they trusted him. Webb just hoped he could live up to that trust. The final push toward Liège was brutal. The terrain grew more difficult, the hill. Around 3 in the morning, they started seeing signs of American presence. Destroyed German vehicles on the roads, shell craters from artillery, and finally, in the distance, the sound of American voices and the rumble of American engines. They'd reached the outskirts of Liège, where the Allied lines had held against the German offensive. They'd reached the outskirts of Liège, where the Allied lines had held against the German offensive. But they couldn't just walk in. Webb remembered his own warning about trigger-happy sentries. They needed to approach carefully. He positioned his men in a skirmish line at the edge of a field, about 200 yards from what looked like an American checkpoint. Then he stood up slowly, hands raised, and walked forward alone. "American patrol," he called out. "Friendly forces. We're coming in." Instantly, multiple rifles trained on him. Searchlights blazed to life, pinning him in their beams. A voice shouted back, hard and suspicious. "What unit?" "1st Platoon, Baker Company, 23rd Infantry Regiment," Webb responded. "We've been cut off behind German lines for 4 days. We have wounded. We need immediate medical assistance." There was a pause. Then the same voice, slightly less hostile. "What's the capital of Texas?" It was a standard verification question, designed to catch German infiltrators who might know American unit designations but not basic American knowledge. "Austin," Webb answered. "Can we please come in? One of my men is in critical condition." Another pause, longer this time. Then, "Come forward slowly. Keep your hands visible. Anyone makes a wrong move, we shoot. Clear?" "Clear," Webb agreed. He turned and signaled his men to follow. They came forward slowly, Hoffman and Washington carrying Chen's stretcher, Roy Kowalski supporting Joe, the rest of them walking like old men, their rifles slung, their hands clearly empty of weapons. As they approached the checkpoint, American soldiers emerged from positions Webb hadn't even noticed, their weapons trained but fingers off triggers now that they could see these were genuinely American troops. A captain was waiting at the checkpoint, his face skeptical but softening as he took in the condition of Webb's patrol. They looked like hell. Dirty, exhausted, bloodied, but still carrying their weapons, still moving as a unit. Still soldiers. "Lieutenant Webb?" the captain asked. "Yes, sir," Webb responded wearily. "Requesting permission to rejoin our lines and get medical attention for our wounded." The captain nodded and turned to shout orders. "Medics! We need medics here, now!" He looked back at Webb and his men with something like respect in his eyes. "You boys have been listed as missing in action for 3 days. Intelligence figured you were all dead or captured. How the hell did you make it through?" Webb looked at his men, at these extraordinary, ordinary Americans who'd done the impossible. They'd survived 4 days behind enemy lines, evaded German patrols, fought their way out of an ambush, and marched through frozen hell to get home. They'd lost 1 man, but 11 had made it. 11 out of 12. Better odds than most units in the Bulge could claim. "We watched each other's backs, sir," Webb said simply. "And we didn't quit." Chen and Joe Kowalski were loaded onto stretchers and rushed to a field hospital. Doc Morrison went with them, still trying to treat them even as medics took over. The rest of the patrol was led to a tent where they were given hot coffee, real food, and warm blankets. They ate mechanically, still too numb and exhausted to fully process that they'd made it. They were safe. They were home. They'd done the impossible. Over the next few hours, as they warmed up and started to recover, intelligence officers debriefed them, pumping them for information about German positions, strength, and movements. Webb gave them everything he'd observed, every detail he could remember. His men filled in gaps, adding their own observations. The intelligence officers listened intently, taking notes, asking sharp questions. Every scrap of information was valuable in the confused situation of the Bulge, where American commanders were still trying to figure out the scope of the German offensive and how to counter it. When the debriefing finally ended, Webb found his men gathered in the tent, sitting close together despite the warmth, still watching each other's backs even though the immediate danger had passed. That's what combat did to men. It welded them together into something stronger than the sum of their parts. They'd always carry this with them, this knowledge that they'd survived together, that they'd brought each other home against impossible odds. News came from the hospital around noon. Chun would recover fully, though he'd be out of action for weeks while his leg healed. But Joe Kowalski had developed sepsis from his infected wound. The doctors were doing everything they could, but it was touch and go. Roy Kowalski sat silent and still when he heard the news, his face a mask. But Webb saw his hands clenched into fists so tight his knuckles were white. They waited together through that afternoon and into the evening, 12 men now reduced to 11, praying they wouldn't lose another. At 8 o'clock that night, a doctor came to the tent with news. Joe Kowalski would live. The antibiotics they'd pumped into him were working. He'd need surgery to clean out the infection, and months of recovery, but he would live. Roy Kowalski's mask finally cracked, and tears ran down his weathered face as he nodded his thanks to the doctor. His little brother would live. They'd both go home. Webb stepped outside the tent into the cold December night and looked up at the stars. Somewhere out there in the darkness, the Battle of the Bulge was still raging. Men were fighting and dying in the frozen forests. But here, in this small corner of the war, 11 men who'd been written off as dead had come back. They'd survived. They'd done their duty. They'd watched each other's backs and refused to quit. They'd been sent into hell, sent to die like so many others had died in this war. But they'd refused to accept that fate. They'd fought, they'd marched, they'd endured, and they'd come home. Not all of them. Cardone was gone, sleeping forever in a Belgian field, but the rest had made it. Against the odds, against the German army, against everything the war could throw at them, they'd made it. In the months and years that followed, as the war continued and eventually ended, as the men of the patrol scattered back to their homes across America, the story of their 4 days behind enemy lines became something of a legend in their regiment. They were the patrol that couldn't be killed, the men who'd walked through German territory like ghosts and come home to tell the tale. Medals were awarded, commendations written, but the real reward was simpler than any piece of metal. They'd survived. They'd brought each other home. They'd proven that training, discipline, trust, and refusal to quit could overcome impossible odds. They'd shown that ordinary men, when tested by extraordinary circumstances, could do extraordinary things. They were farmers and miners, students and engineers, railway porters and veterinarians, just regular Americans who'd been called to serve and had answered that call with everything they had. Webb went back to Philadelphia after the war and finished his architecture degree. He designed buildings that stood as monuments to permanence and beauty, but he never forgot that what he'd built with 11 other men in 4 frozen December days was more important than any building. He'd helped build something that couldn't be measured in stone and steel. He'd helped build brotherhood, courage, and hope in the darkest of times. Chun recovered and went home to California, where he worked tirelessly for Japanese-American civil rights, using his war record to argue that loyalty wasn't determined by ancestry. The Kowalski brothers went back to Pennsylvania and opened a hardware store together, where they spent their days helping neighbors and never talking about the war except with each other, late at night, when the memories were too strong to ignore. Doc Morrison became the surgeon he'd always dreamed of being, and he never charged a veteran for medical care, not once in 40 years of practice. Martinez went back to Los Angeles and became a teacher, shaping young minds and telling them stories about courage and perseverance without ever mentioning that he'd lived those lessons in the frozen forests of Belgium. Washington worked for the railway again, but this time as a manager, breaking barriers and opening doors for others who came after him. Breslin returned to his Iowa farm and found that the predictability he'd once fled now felt like peace, like safety, like home. He married his high school sweetheart and raised 4 children, teaching them that there was honor in simple work and that not all heroes wore uniforms. Leibovitz went back to electrical engineering and eventually helped design some of the first computers. His brilliant mind that had once tried desperately to fix a radio in a Belgian farmhouse now solving problems that would shape the future of technology. Boucher returned to Louisiana and became a fishing guide, spending his days on quiet bayous where the only sounds were birds and water, so different from the sounds of war that sometimes he'd wake up amazed that he'd survived to hear such peace. Hoffman went back to Wisconsin and reconnected with his German heritage without shame, helping to build bridges between former enemies and proving that ancestry didn't determine character. Washington kept in touch with all of them, becoming the unofficial keeper of the patrol's history. He organized reunions every 5 years, and they would gather, these men who'd shared 4 days that felt like a lifetime, and they would remember. They'd remember Cardone, who died in a Belgian valley and whose family received a medal and a folded flag but could never really understand what their son had done, what he'd meant to the men who'd fought beside him. They'd drink to his memory and tell stories about his toughness, his humor, his unwavering courage. The years passed, as years do, and the men grew older. They watched their children grow up in a world shaped by the war they'd fought, a world where America had emerged as a superpower, where the enemy they'd faced had been utterly defeated, where freedom had triumphed over tyranny. They'd been part of that, these ordinary men. They'd contributed to that victory in their own small way, by refusing to quit, by watching each other's backs, by making it home to tell the tale. By the 1990s, when they gathered for what would be their last full reunion, only 8 of them were left. Time had claimed Hoffman to a heart attack in 1978, Washington to cancer in 1983, and Breslin to a farming accident in 1987. The remaining 8 sat together in a hotel conference room in Washington, D.C. Old men now, their hair white or gone, their bodies bent by age, but their bond as strong as it had been in that Belgian cellar 50 years earlier. Webb, now in his 70s, looked around at his men and saw ghosts too. Not just the ghosts of those who died in the war or in the years since, but ghosts of who they'd been. Young men in their 20s and 30s, frightened but determined, cold and tired but still fighting. He saw Kowalski cleaning his rifle with steady hands, Chin working on the radio that refused to function, Doc Morrison counting his medical supplies, Cardone sharpening his knife. He saw them all as they'd been, and he was grateful beyond words that some of them had survived to grow old, to have lives and families and careers, to know peace. "We did something," Roy Kowalski said suddenly, his voice rough with age but still carrying that same gravelly quality that came from years of coal dust and cigarettes. "Something that mattered. I want you all to know that. Those 4 days, they weren't just about surviving. They were about proving something. Proving that Americans don't quit. That we take care of each other. That we finish what we start." Martinez nodded slowly. "My students ask me sometimes what the war was like. I never know what to tell them. How do you explain what it meant to be so scared you could barely breathe, but to keep moving anyway because the men around you were counting on you? How do you explain what it felt like to know that any moment could be your last, but to find a way to laugh anyway, to crack jokes, to stay human?" "You tell them the truth," Chin said quietly. "You tell them it was hell, but you also tell them it brought out the best in people. That when everything else was stripped away, all the comfort and safety and certainty, what remained was what really mattered. Loyalty, courage, love for your brothers. That's what got us through. Not tactics or training or equipment. Each other." Joe Kowalski, walking with a cane now, the old wound in his leg still bothering him after all these years, raised his glass. "To the ones who didn't make it. To Cardone. To all the boys who didn't come home. We carried them with us. We're still carrying them. They drank to that, these old soldiers, and then they told the stories again. The same stories they told at every reunion, but stories that never got old because they were true, because they lived them, because they were part of something bigger than themselves. They talked about the ambush, about the desperate fight to survive, about carrying Chin on a stretcher through enemy territory, about the moment they'd finally seen American lines and known they'd made it. And they talked about what came after, how the Battle of the Bulge had eventually been won, how the German offensive had been stopped and then reversed, how Allied forces had pushed into Germany and brought the war in Europe to an end. Their small story had been part of that larger story, one patrol among thousands, one small act of courage among millions. But it had mattered. They'd mattered. Doc Morrison, now a retired surgeon with hands that trembled slightly from Parkinson's disease but had saved hundreds of lives over his career, spoke with the quiet authority he'd always carried. I've been thinking about those 4 days a lot lately, about the decisions we made, the things we did, and I realize now that what we accomplished wasn't just military. It was human. We proved that people can endure more than they think they can. That hope isn't foolish, it's essential. That taking care of each other isn't weakness, it's the greatest strength there is. Leibovitz, who'd helped usher in the computer age and watched technology transform the world in ways he could never have imagined back in that Belgian farmhouse, nodded thoughtfully. We were just trying to survive. We weren't thinking about lessons or legacy or what it all meant. We were cold and scared and running on empty. But somehow, without planning it, we created something that's lasted longer than any of us expected. Not just friendship, though we've got that, but proof. Proof that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they have to. When they have each other. Boucher, his Louisiana accent still thick after all these years, smiled softly. You know what I remember most? Not the fear, though Lord knows there was plenty of that. Not even the cold, though I thought I'd never be warm again. What I remember is the feeling of being part of something. Of knowing that if I fell, someone would pick me up. That if I couldn't go on, someone would help me. That I wasn't alone. In the middle of that frozen hell, surrounded by enemies, cut off from everything, I wasn't alone. That's what I carried home with me. That's what I've tried to give to other people in my life. That sense of not being alone. As the reunion wound down and the men prepared to return to their separate lives, Webb gathered them one more time. They stood in a circle, these 8 old warriors, and they clasped hands the way they'd done before moving out that last night in Belgium, before the final push to safety. Webb looked at each face, memorizing them, knowing that this might be the last time they were all together. We were sent to die, he said, echoing the hook that had defined their story for 50 years. The odds were against us. The enemy was all around us. We had every reason to give up, to quit, to accept that we weren't going to make it. But we didn't. We refused. We fought and we marched and we carried each other, and we came home. Not all of us. Cardone didn't make it. But most of us did. And we've lived good lives. We've raised families, built careers, contributed to our communities. We've been good men because we learned how to be good men in those 4 days when being good men meant the difference between life and death. He paused, his voice thick with emotion. I'm proud of all of you. Proud of what we did. Proud of what we became. And when my time comes, when I cross over to wherever we go when we leave this world, I hope I see Cardone waiting there. I hope I can tell him that we remembered him. That we honored him by living well, by being the kind of men worth saving. That his sacrifice wasn't in vain. They stood there in silence for a long moment, 8 old men holding hands, connected by bonds that transcended time and distance and age. Then, without anyone suggesting it, they bowed their heads, and Doc Morrison spoke one last prayer. Lord, thank you for bringing us through. Thank you for giving us each other. Thank you for the years we've had, the lives we've lived. Watch over us now as we go our separate ways. And when we meet again, whether in this world or the next, let it be with the same love and loyalty we've shown each other all these years. Amen. The amens echoed around the circle, and then they broke apart, these legends who never asked to be legends, who just done their duty and survived. They hugged, they made promises to stay in touch, they took one last photograph together, and then they went home to their families, carrying with them the weight and the glory of what they'd done. Webb died in 2003, peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by children and grandchildren who'd heard the stories of the patrol so many times they could recite them from memory. At his funeral, 7 old men in their 80s sat in the front row, the last survivors of that forgotten patrol. They wore their dress uniforms, the medals they'd earned shining on their chests, and they wept for their lieutenant, the young man who'd led them home through impossible odds. One by one over the next decade, they followed him. Roy Kowalski in 2006, his heart finally giving out after 86 years of steady beating. Chin in 2008, surrounded by the Japanese-American community he'd fought so hard to help. Martinez in 2010, his students coming from across the country to say goodbye to the teacher who'd shaped their lives. Joe Kowalski in 2011, finally reunited with the brother who'd carried him through hell. Doc Morrison in 2012, his healing hands finally at rest. By 2015, only two remained. Leibovitz and Boucher, the engineer and the fishing guide, two men who couldn't have been more different but who'd been bound together by 4 days in December 1944. They met one last time, in a veterans' hospital where Leibovitz was dying of the cancer that had been eating away at him for 2 years. Boucher sat beside his bed, holding his hand, and they talked about the old days, about the men they'd known, about the impossible thing they'd done. "We were legends," Leibovitz said, his voice barely a whisper. "Not because we tried to be, but because we refused to die. Because we watched each other's backs. Because we came home." "We did," Boucher agreed, tears streaming down his weathered face. "We came home, and we made it count. Every year we lived, every life we touched, every good thing we did, it was all because of those 4 days. Because we learned what really mattered." Leibovitz closed his eyes, a small smile on his face. "Tell them," he said. "When I'm gone, tell the story. Don't let it be forgotten. Don't let people forget that ordinary men can do extraordinary things. That Americans don't quit. That brotherhood is stronger than death. I'll tell them," Boucher promised. "I'll make sure they remember." Leibovitz died that night, and Boucher kept his promise. He spent his remaining years telling the story to anyone who would listen. To high school classes studying World War II. To veterans groups. To historians documenting the Battle of the Bulge. He told them about 12 men who'd been cut off behind enemy lines, about the lieutenant who led them home, about the soldier who died so the others could live, about the bonds that had held them together through hell and beyond. When Boucher finally died in 2018 at the age of 96, the last survivor of the forgotten patrol, the story didn't die with him. It lived on in books and documentaries, in memorial plaques and museum exhibits. It lived on in the descendants of those 12 men, who told their children and grandchildren about the patrol that couldn't be killed, the men who'd walked through German territory like ghosts, and come home to become legends. The story lived on because it was true, because it embodied something essential about the American spirit, about what happens when ordinary people are tested by extraordinary circumstances and refuse to break. Because it reminded people that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's moving forward despite fear. That loyalty isn't just a word, it's a choice you make every day to stand by the people who stand by you. That hope isn't naive optimism, it's the stubborn refusal to accept defeat even when defeat seems inevitable. They were sent to die, those 12 men of the forgotten patrol. The odds said they should have died. Logic said they couldn't possibly survive 4 days behind enemy lines in the middle of the largest battle the American army had ever fought. History should have swallowed them up. Just 12 more names on the long list of casualties from the Battle of the Bulge, forgotten except by the families who mourned them. But they didn't die. Most of them didn't. They survived because they refused to quit. They survived because they took care of each other. They survived because a young lieutenant from Philadelphia made good decisions under impossible pressure, because a sergeant from Pennsylvania stayed calm under fire, because a medic from a veterinary school kept wounded men alive with almost no supplies, because ordinary Americans did extraordinary things when the situation demanded it. And in surviving, they became legends. Not the kind of legends that get made into blockbuster movies or that everyone knows by name, but the quiet kind of legend, the important kind, the kind that proves what human beings are capable of when they're at their best. The kind that reminds us that heroism isn't just about grand gestures and dramatic moments, but about putting one foot in front of the other when you're exhausted, about carrying a wounded comrade when your arms are burning with fatigue, about staying human in situations designed to strip away your humanity. Their story is a reminder that the greatest generation earned that title not through some inherent superiority, but through what they did when history called on them. They were ordinary people who lived through extraordinary times and rose to meet the challenges those times presented. They were farmers and students, coal miners and engineers, the sons of immigrants, and the descendants of slaves, and they came together to fight for something bigger than themselves. The forgotten patrol wasn't forgotten after all. They were remembered. They are remembered. They will be remembered as long as people care about courage, loyalty, sacrifice, and the indomitable human spirit that refuses to surrender even in the darkest hours. They came back as legends because they deserve to be legends, because their story needed to be told, because we all need reminders of what we're capable of when we refuse to quit and refuse to abandon each other. They were 12 ordinary men who did something extraordinary. They were sent to die but came back as legends, and their story will live on, inspiring others to find their own courage, to watch each other's backs, to keep moving forward no matter what obstacles stand in their way. Because that's what legends do. They show us not what we are, but what we could be, what we should aspire to be, what we can be when we're at our best. The Forgotten Patrol. 12 men, 4 days, one impossible mission. They made it home. They lived good lives. They never forgot each other or what they'd shared. And now, long after they're all gone, their story remains, a testament to the power of human courage, loyalty, and determination. A reminder that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. That Americans don't quit. That brotherhood is stronger than death. That legends aren't born, they're made, forged in the fires of hardship and tempered by the refusal to surrender. They were sent to die, but they came back as legends. And in doing so, they gave us all a gift. The gift of their example. The gift of their story. The gift of knowing that when the world seems darkest, when the odds seem impossible, when giving up would be so much easier than pushing forward, we can look to their example and find the strength to take one more step, to help one more person, to refuse to surrender one more time. That's what makes a legend, not the absence of fear or doubt or exhaustion, but the presence of courage in the face of fear, determination in the face of doubt, perseverance in the face of exhaustion. The Forgotten Patrol embodied all of that and more. They were, and remain, legends in the truest sense of the word. And their story will continue to inspire as long as there are people who need reminding that the human spirit, when tested, proves again and again to be stronger than any force that tries to break it.